This morning, we're going to do some thinking about why it is that there is still such a stigma attached to issues around mental health, so much so that Queen's University accepts a big sum of money from Bell Canada to appoint a researcher whose task is to do research around stigma and mental health and then to share her information. She will be speaking here at St. Andrews next month. So I went back into the biblical text to check out how and possibly why communities have always drawn lines around who's in and who's out, who is acceptable and who is not acceptable. So it's not new for the human race to stigmatize the outsider. And then we'll do some thinking about why mental health continues to be, for example, remember when we didn't talk about cancer? Remember when All in the Family finally put the conversation in people's living rooms when Edith was diagnosed with breast cancer? Remember? And at that time, if you were diagnosed with breast cancer, you didn't talk about it. So it's interesting how our culture evolves and what's still behind the curtain. They came to Jericho, and he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." But many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly. He would not let them silence him. "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And he said, "Take heart. Get up." So he threw off his cloak and he sprang up and he came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Now reading from Nino Ricci's book, Testament, where he imagines a life of Jesus based on his readings of the gospel. This is from Peter's perspective as he has followed Jesus into the community of lepers. Sitting among the lepers, I did not feel quite so cynical. For the longest time, not even aware I was doing it, I stood well back from the circle they had formed around Jesus. So repulsed was I by their smell and their hideousness, and so accustomed to keeping lepers at a distance. But perhaps it was their own unthinking acceptance of my aversion, even as they sat conversing in the most normal fashion with Jesus, that shamed me. That brought home to me not only how quick we all were to judge by appearances, but also how deeply ingrained were the prejudices that got passed on to us. It was a second nature in a Jew to see in a leper's affliction a sign of hopeless corruption. But it took only a few minutes among them to see they were merely average sorts of beings like the rest of us, made perhaps more humble and timid by their isolation, but still recognizable as people you might have passed in the streets of any village. Afterwards, I could hardly remember what was talked about. The most mundane of things, what had been done in the towns for the feasts, how the harvests had been, what marriages had taken place, petty matters I would not have imagined that Jesus would have paid the least attention to, but within a matter of minutes I was sitting there amidst the others and had almost forgotten their deformities so much had the smallest acquaintance with their inner selves transformed my vision of their outer ones. World, only 57% of Canadian adults and 43% of Canadian youth report a high capacity to cope with unexpected and difficult problems and day-to-day demands, which means that 43% of Canadian adults find it difficult to cope with unexpected problems and day-to-day demands. On January 14th, on the Sunday edition, host Michael Enright featured One Judge Down. It told the story, it was a documentary really, of how Chief Justice Gerald Ledane, considered to be one of Canada's finest 20th century minds, was forced to resign because of a bout with depression. His daughter, Carolyn Burgess, recalls the following. September the 7th, 1988 was the day my dad was diagnosed with a clinical depression. And so my mother went to the Chief Justice to say, Gerald is ill. He needs some time. And that's when the Chief Justice began to speak about my father in the past tense. In particular, his mind. He had a brilliant mind. As if somehow mental illness is associated with some kind of brain damage. In other words, there was no question from the reception my mother got from the Chief Justice that there was going to be any support. There wasn't an enlightened kind of sense of, well, okay, this is treatable. He will recover. He can come back. There was just that sense of, it's done. And then very shortly after, I think it was within 2 weeks, he was pressured to resign from the Supreme Court. I don't think he had any choice. What could he have done? Get a lawyer? Could he have fought it? He was ill. This was something that clearly they didn't want made public. They didn't want him back. It was devastating. So why is that? Why did a man who, go to Wikipedia, had made such a contribution to Canada on so many levels, why, just like that, did he get edged out for a bout of depression? Well, if you can see up here, there's an iceberg. And when you really want to look at what's happening in society and understand what makes things tick up here, you have to go right to the bottom of the iceberg. And very often, you can see it's right underneath the water, right? So we are very often not even aware of what our deep-held cultural values are. So above the water, it goes like this. Oh, you're depressed. Just a little bit below the water, it's something like, what's wrong with you? Go a little deeper. I hope I won't catch it. And go even deeper than that is, so you look at what happened to Gerald Ledane, and it was a reaction as a result of deep-held, hidden values around mental health. Let me share with you, I think, just a few snapshots of, Well, we'll share some words from Gabor Mate. First, Gabor Mate is a psychiatrist who has done a lot of research on addiction, who believes that at the heart of addiction is a disconnection, and is deeply convinced that all of our mental health is connected to connection. But he has some words to say about the problem with what we understand to be normal.
One of the talks that I give is entitled The Myth of Normal, which is to say that we think that there are people who are normal over here, and then there's the pathological ones who have depression or anxiety or addiction or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any number of other ADHD or any number of other conditions. What I see is a continuum, that we're all on a continuum. These traits, to one degree or another, are present in almost everybody. And it's a mythology to think that there's the normal and then there's the abnormal. Well, according to the research, the best place to be a schizophrenic in the world is not North America with all its pharmacopoeia. It's actually a village in Africa or India, where there's acceptance, where people make room for your differentness, where connection is not broken but is maintained, where you're not excluded and ostracized but where you're welcomed, and when there's room for you to act out whatever you need to act out, or to express whatever you need to express. And the whole community might even sing with you or chant with you or hold ceremony with you. And maybe find some meaning in your quote-unquote craziness. So it's contextual and it's cultural. So disease is not an isolated phenomenon of an individual. It's a culturally manufactured or culturally constructed paradigm. So a society that cuts us off from our spirituality, that cuts us off from society by idealizing individualism and by destroying social contexts, which our society does, which ignores our emotional needs, is going to be a society that generates pathology. And I think that has to do with the very nature of the economic system that says that what matters is not who you are, but how you are valued by others. And our society values people for material. It's a materialistic society, which specifically means that what we value is not who people are, but what they produce or what they consume. And the people that neither consume nor produce, they're ostracized, they're shunted aside, and they're totally devalued. Hence the rejection of old people, because they no longer produce, and they're not rich enough to consume a lot either. So the very nature of this materialistic society dictates or generates and promotes that separation from ourselves.
So I'm trying to provide you with snapshots, each giving us something to think about. Here's the next one. Driving to Presbytery on Tuesday, I caught an interview with Anna Maria Tremonti, who was talking to a professor from Yale University. Turns out that the largest attendance class now at Yale University is the undergraduate class of psychology and human happiness. They developed this class after looking at statistics around anxiety and depression among those people in universities across North America. What they discovered was that there was a pandemic of anxiety and depression among university students. And so they constructed this class based on research, scientific research, on what made people happy. And I was sitting there in the car thinking, wow, Yale University, one of the Ivy League colleges, and I'm wondering, 30 years ago, if you would have said to those in charge, we really need a class on people being happy. And it's interesting how the professor being interviewed kept having to say, This is based on scientific research. So, 30% of all the undergraduates take that class. They are themselves invited to do research, but on top of that, and provide papers. But the real work is changing the way they live and incorporating 3 practices that research tell us make us happier, feel more connected, and therefore less anxious. And it's not rocket science. The students are sent off with their journals that will hold them accountable to practicing self-care, practice kindness to others, and practice gratitude. Nothing new under the sun. But these students, so many of them, in a much more competitive society and a much more competitive economy, head to university with this sense that if they are not highly successful, they will not get a job, they will not get the marks that they need to get into the market, and they will be failures. And I think at some level this perspective echoes what Gabor Mate was saying. In a market-driven economy, when suddenly the pie is getting smaller, and there is this sense that I had better be perfect, I had better find myself in that top 3%, or else I'm not going to get a piece of the pie. Well, if that isn't a recipe for crazy, what is? And somehow I suspect that we aren't quite aware how that culture, that market-driven economy, that what makes you valuable, has somehow snuck up on us. And now it is looking at us in the face through the eyes of our youth. I think, though, that the addiction to perfection that may be latent in our culture is a little bit more insidious than that. I got a phone call after last week's service by somebody who wanted to ask me a question about what I said, and then went on to say, you know what, Lynne? This addiction to perfection, she goes, I know I'm swimming in it. I think most of us who are boomers are swimming in it. It's insidious. There's this sense that if we only look after ourselves, we can do it all. We can do it for our kids, we can do it for our partners, we can do it for the parents we're looking after. And she said, I know so many people who are drowning in their inability to live up to some expectation that has been communicated through deep in the iceberg. And finally, a bit of an international perspective as well. Vandana Shiva is an Indian physicist who's brilliant. I encourage you to go and find out more about her. But here she says, I think the only people who are happy, and deeply secure are people who know they can rely on someone else in life, people who know they are not alone in the world. Lonely people have never been happy people. And globalization is creating a very lonely planet. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying, oh, well, now we know why we have a pandemic of people struggling with mental health. No. It's a little bit more complex than that, but it's important, nevertheless, that we look at what is in all those stories, and in particular, look at what is deeply seated in our culture, right down at the bottom of the iceberg. It's important we face that if we are going to change the way that we engage with conversations around mental health, but more than that, engage with one another in our own struggles around mental health. So to conclude, there is something wired into human culture that builds in an exclusivity. And over the centuries, depending on the culture, the lines are drawn differently. And so at the time of Jesus, it was physical illness that was interpreted to be punishment from God, and therefore ample reason to exclude. And how beautiful that image that Nina Ricci creates of Jesus going into the caves where the lepers had been banned, and sitting and eating and drinking with them, as he would eat and drink with everyone. But we know that conversations around mental health are so much more challenging now. And so we have Yale University responding to an anxiety epidemic because students are paralyzed by expectations and fear and some sense of not living up to a standard. And these are like the brightest. Just like Gerald Ledane was among the brightest. Let's remember that. It's all of us. Those with whom I shared this conversation talked about that sense that there was a standard out there that they did not believe they could measure up to because of their own anxiety or depression, which then further implied that indeed they were inadequate. They could not measure up, and therefore they could not completely belong. And so how do we as a Christian community support one another in this climate of addiction to perfection, this climate where we stigmatize those so that they're afraid to be honest about where they are, and then further facilitate the loneliness and the fear that accompanies that sense of failure. Heather Stewart, the researcher from Queen's University who will give a talk next month, said to me, churches just need to be who they say they are. They need to be inclusive communities. They need to live as those who, after the example of Jesus, do not treat those who are different as other. And I guess we do this together in subtle and not so subtle ways. First, we recognize that there are those who, while resilient in some ways, are fragile in others, or will suffer from periods of fragility in their lives. And like I said last week, in those periods of fragility have a distorted view of their acceptability. And so that invitation that comes with the John Bell hymn that we started with, will you love the you hide, if I but call your name? Will you kill the fear inside, if I but call your name? The wisdom shared by Heather Stewart, the wisdom gleaned from the research done by Yale University, is our wisdom. Look out for one another. Include one another. Be a safe place for one another. Try and understand one another. And I think the other piece takes a bit of courage, because the other piece has to do with saying no to everything, to every attitude, to every cultural value that suggests that we do not measure up. I know that is hard when the values are very often feeding the culture from a deep, deep place. We're swimming in it. The ministry of Jesus affirms again and again that we intrinsically belong. And our task is then to affirm again and again when we come up against deep-seated values whose tendency it is to exclude, to challenge those values that don't just exclude, but they also blame and they shame. So if we are being who we say we are, we will serve as safe harbors for one another. And more particularly for one another when we are wrestling with mental health. But we need to be intentional both as individuals and a community to earn the trust of one another with our words and our attitude. So during this time for contemplation, I invite you to connect with the Spirit that was in Jesus when he looked straight at Bartimaeus and said, "You, don't listen to them who are trying to shut you down. You come and tell me what you need." Or connect with the Spirit of Jesus who gathered among the caves with those who were treated with the most incredible derision and sat and dined with them and asked about their kids and commented on this year's harvest. Connect with that Spirit and love the you that you hide.